Hello and welcome to Eurostat's webinar series. I'm Dean Vuletic, an Information and Communication Officer in Eurostat, and I'm your moderator for today's webinar. Today we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, Monitoring Report. The 2025 edition has just been published, so this is a chance for you to be among the first to learn about the European Union's progress towards the SDGs. And my colleague Friederike Oehler will talk to you more about that. We'll also hear about the role of the new European Commission priorities regarding the implementation of the SDGs in the EU, and Lucian Parvulescu from the European Commission's Secretariat General will speak about that. Now, the 17 SDGs are at the heart of the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. They provide a global, comprehensive policy framework towards ending all forms of poverty, fighting inequalities, protecting the environment, and tackling climate change while ensuring that no one is left behind. Please let me introduce Friederike Oehler from Unit E2, which focuses on environmental statistics and accounts and sustainable development. Friederike is the team leader for Sustainable Development Indicators, and today she'll talk to us about monitoring progress towards the SDGs in an EU context. Friederike, welcome.
Hello, Dean. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today and present to you our most recent monitoring results of the EU moving towards the SDGs.
Thank you for joining us, Friederike. Now, could you tell us what it is exactly that you're monitoring?
Right, yes. So we are monitoring how the EU is doing in achieving the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 SDGs include economic, social, environmental, and institutional objectives, and they have been adopted globally in 2015. We monitor the EU's progress towards these goals along a set of 102 indicators, so 6 indicators for each goal. And we are basing our indicators on the objectives and ambitions of the UN goals, but we focus on what's relevant for the EU. So we have 26 indicators that measure concrete EU policy targets. And of course, all of our indicators need to be of a really high statistical quality.
And how do you measure progress towards these targets?
The basic steps are really simple. So we calculate the compound annual growth rate for each of the indicators over the most recent 5-year period. We then compare this observed growth rate to the growth rate required to meet the target at a constant pace. We then use thresholds to qualify the progress according to the growth rate ratio. And I can show you this in that example for SDG 13, the climate action. So what results from this indicator assessment are then these nice green upward-looking arrows or the red downward-looking arrows that indicate whether the EU has made significant or moderate progress towards the indicator's objective, or whether the EU has been moving away or making progress, but not sufficient to meet the objective at the current pace. And you can also find these little target symbols here, which indicate those indicators where we have a concrete policy target that we measure. For all the other indicators, we do assess whether they are moving into the desired direction and at which pace do they move. And if we then aggregate the results for all these individual indicators at the goal level, we get an average progress score for each of the SDGs, which in this example for SDG 13 on climate action is somewhere in the middle range.
So, Frederica, could you give us some of the key results of the 2025 monitoring?
Of course, very pleased to do so. So, if we put the progress goals of all the individual goals onto this horizontal axis that you see here, we easily see which of the goals have been performing best and for which goals the EU is still lacking behind. So you can immediately see that the best performing goal this year has again been SDG 10 on reduced inequalities, closely followed by SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth. And then a nice change to last year's assessment, we have SDG 4 on quality education, also in the significant progress area. For most of the other SDGs, we are finding a moderate progress at varying paces. And then we also have 3 out of the 17 SDGs for which there is either no progress or even a movement away from our objectives, which are SDG 14, the life below water, SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, and SDG 15, life on land. So I may go into a bit more details for some of these goals. So as I mentioned, SDG 10 is our best performing goal this year. And this is mainly due to income inequality continuing to decrease and also the poverty gap narrowing. At the same time, we have the disparities in disposable household income per capita. So these are disparities between EU countries that are decreasing since 2000 and have come to an all-time low in 2023. Further to that, we found positive developments for the citizenship gap, which means that non-EU citizens are slowly but surely getting closer to the EU citizens in terms of employment rate, monetary poverty, early school leavers, and also the neither in employment nor in education and training rate. If we have a closer look at SDG 8, where we are also well on track towards the objectives, this is mainly due to an excellent employment rate of 75.8% in 2024, which means that the EU is well on track to meet its target of 78% employment by 2030. At the same time, the long-term unemployment rate has come to an all-time low, and also the other employment and work indicators show really positive developments. And adding to this, also the real GDP per capita has been increasing for the EU. So the only indicator in this goal which is unsatisfying is the share of GDP that businesses, households, and governments invest. So this is an area where the EU can still catch up.
Frederica, you previously mentioned SDG 4 regarding quality education, and we've actually seen a lot of progress with regards to this goal, right?
Yes, this year SDG 4 ranks on the 3rd place, showing very positive developments for all but one indicator. So the EU is well on track now to reach its 2030 targets of having 96% of more than 3-year-old children in early childhood education, to reduce the share of early school leavers to less than 9%, and to have at least 45% of young adults reaching a tertiary education degree. On the downside of the education, we see the share of low achieving 15-year-olds in the PISA assessment of reading, maths, and science proficiency levels, which unfortunately has decreased very strongly.
So, for which SDGs have we seen moderate progress, Frederica?
Right. So in the moderate progress area, we find SDG 5, SDG 12, 9, and 2 that are all doing really pretty well, with the majority of indicators showing positive developments. In SDG 12, for example, we have the consumption footprint and the consumption of hazardous chemicals that has decreased significantly in 2023. At the same time, the gross value added in the environmental goods and services sector increased a lot. By contrast, the circular material use rate of the EU is unfortunately still stagnating, which means that the EU really needs to step up efforts if we want to reach our target of doubling the materials we use from collected waste by 2030 compared to 2020. Still in the moderate progress area, we also find SDG 1, 7, 17, and 11. And particularly noteworthy here is SDG 7, which has improved a lot compared to last year. Thanks to the energy policies that support efficiency improvements across all sectors, the primary energy consumption continued to decline strongly in 2023. And also the energy that the average citizen consumes at home for heating, cooling, cooking, and so on decreased by 9% since 2018. Unfortunately, we have still a very high share of people reporting to be unable to keep their homes warm and this rate is increasing since the energy price hikes in 2021. Then also in the moderate progress area, but moving at a much slower pace are SDGs 13, 16, and 3. Nevertheless, in SDG 13, the climate action, we see that the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions accelerated compared to last year, and the removal of carbon through the land use change and forestry sector increased again after a low in 2022. The share of renewable energies also continues to increase, even though not fast enough yet to meet our 2030 target. SDG 3 is making slow progress, but it has it has improved a lot compared to last year's assessment, which can partly still be attributed to the post-COVID recovery of avoidable mortality, but it's also due to fewer fatal accidents at work and fewer premature deaths due to air pollution. The EU still needs to do more to decrease the number of road accidents and the consumption of antibiotics. And SDG 16 has fallen back since last year's assessment, and this is due to the improvements of the homicide rate slowing down, but also a deteriorating perception of the independence of justice systems in EU member states and the corruption perception index that has fallen in 2024, meaning that more people perceive their public sector to be corrupt. For the other goals in this with moderate progress, I recommend you to have a look at our brand new EU SDG progress tracker, where you will find the results for all the individual indicators.
So, Friederike, you've shown us some examples in which significant progress has been made, in which moderate progress has been made. But when it comes to the goals in which progress hasn't been made so well, could you give us some more information about those?
Of course, yes. So as I mentioned before, unfortunately, there has been no progress for SDG 14, life below water. And this is because the ocean acidity caused by the absorption of CO2 in the seawater reached an unprecedented level in 2024. And also the situation for marine eutrophication is still really worrying. In addition, the designation of marine protected areas really needs to accelerate if we want to reach the target of having 30% of marine areas protected by 2030. SDG 6, unfortunately, is moving away from our objectives, and this is related to water quality and water scarcity. Nitrate in groundwater and phosphates in rivers have increased, and at the same time, we see a much stronger pressure on freshwater resources, which is reflected in the Water Exploitation Index that measures the total water consumption as a percentage of the renewable freshwater resources available. In addition, the area impacted by drought has been increasing continuously since 2018 in the 10-year moving average that we are using to assess this indicator due to the high year-to-year fluctuations. And then again, like in last year's assessment, SDG 15, life on land, is really lagging behind. There is partly an overlap here with SDG 6 because the drought impact area and the phosphates in rivers are indicators that are also being used in SDG 15. But in addition to that, what is really worrying is the movement away from the objectives on biodiversity. The abundance of grassland butterflies is declining rapidly since many years, and the situation is hardly any better for the common birds, in particular the farmland birds. And again, also the terrestrial protected areas must expand rather rapidly if we want to reach our 2030 target.
There are some novelties in this monitoring, right? Frederica, this is, of course, not the first monitoring. So can you tell us what's new?
Yes, with much pleasure. So what is really new in this year's monitoring report is that for the first time, we have included a chapter on EU SDG indicators at the regional level. So we have picked a selection of indicators from the economic, social, and environmental domain that we are showing in this chapter. We do not assess progress of the single regions, but we show you the regional variations of some of these indicators. So, for example, you will find in this chapter a nice map on the change in employment rates by the NUTS2 regions from 2019 to 2024, but also visualizations that show you the regional disparities, like here, for example, for the premature deaths due to exposure to fine particulate matter, where you can nicely compare not only the EU member state averages, the national averages that are depicted here with the blue dots, but you can also see the disparities, the regional disparities within countries depicted with the yellow dots here.
Frederica, when we look at the European Union, how does it compare to the major economies in the world when it comes to progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals?
So we do not assess the progress that the other regions do in Sustainable Development Goals, of course, but we do compare the EU with other major economies for a selection of indicators. So just one example here is the greenhouse gas emissions per capita that we are plotting here over GDP per capita. And what we find is you have on the y-axis the greenhouse gas emissions, and on the x-axis, the GDP per capita. It is generally maintained that greenhouse gas emissions must necessarily increase if we want to achieve a higher GDP. But what we see here is that even though the EU has a higher GDP than, for example, China or Russia, Japan, or South Korea, we are emitting less carbon than those countries.
And the monitoring also looks at spillover effects. Can you tell us what these are exactly?
So the spillover effects are the impacts of EU consumption on third countries. So we are emitting greenhouse gas emissions in the EU for products that are consumed in the EU, but we also emit greenhouse gas emissions in other countries outside of the EU for products that are then imported and consumed in the EU. And this is the blue bars that you can see in this graph here. And what we can see is that after a low in 2020, those greenhouse gas emissions emitted outside of the EU, but linked to the EU consumption, has increased again in 2021 and 2022.
Thank you, Frederica. That was very informative. Now, if we're looking for more information, if we want to learn more about all of this, where do we go?
I really invite you to go onto our website where you'll find a lot more information. You can, of course, find all our 2025 monitoring results in the full report with the blue cover here. But if you only want to get a very quick overview, we have a brochure which has a gray cover, and it presents you all of our results in a very concise and visual way. I again would invite you to have a look at our new SDG EU progress tracker, where you can find the average progress for each of the goals, but also the assessment for the individual indicators. And if you'd like to compare maybe your own country with other EU countries, we have the SDGs and Me tool, where you can select different countries and compare progress in each of them. And then, of course, we have all our data published on Eurostat's dissemination database, and also our website provides methodological notes. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Frederica. I definitely need to try that SDGs and Me tool. So I very much appreciate this thorough overview that you've given us of the 2025 monitoring of the EU's progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And now it's time for Lucian to tell us about the European Commission's implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Lucian is a policy officer for skills, jobs and social affairs in the European Commission's Secretariat General. Over to you, Lucian.
Thank you for the floor. Frederica's presentation detailed what the most recent data shows about SDG progress at EU level. I will complement it with some brief notes on the Commission's general approach to implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I'd like to open with a quote from Nelson Mandela, who reminded us that what counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead. I'm sure that this captures the ethos of many in our audience today. Scientists, practitioners, journalists, citizens interested in sustainable development and passionate about creating meaningful change in the world. According to the latest global report on SDG progress by the UN Secretary General, the world is on track or making moderate progress on 35% of the SDG targets. Progress on 47% of the targets is insufficient, and there has been a regression from the 2015 baseline in relation to 18% of the targets, as measured by the UN. With only 5 years until the 2030 deadline, there is a vital need to intensify efforts. Looking specifically at the EU, it is worth recalling that sustainable development is a core principle of the Treaty on European Union and a priority objective for the Union's internal and external policies alike. It aims to achieve a continuous improvement in citizens' quality of life and well-being without compromising the well-being of future generations. The Commission implements the SDGs through a whole-of-government approach, placing the 2030 Agenda at the core of EU policy, legislation, and funding. This approach was presented in a document adopted 5 years ago, at the beginning of the previous mandate, and reinforced in the EU voluntary review on SDG implementation presented at the UN in 2023. The links to these documents and much more are available in the monitoring report. The key strands of the Commission's approach are eightfold: designing and effectively applying deeply transformative policies, coordinating member states' economic policies, the EU budget, mainstreaming the SDGs in policy making using better regulation tools, among others, ensuring policy coherence for sustainable development, EU engagement in the world, monitoring and reporting, of which this Eurostat report represents an essential element, and engagement of civil society, the private sector, and other stakeholders. This approach was and continues to be successful. For example, with the first von der Leyen Commission, the SDGs have been put at the heart of deliverables such as the European Green Deal, the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan, the European Health Union, the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, and Next Generation EU, to name but a few. SDGs are mainstreamed in the annual legislative work programs, in the Better Regulation Toolbox, as well in the European semester of a cycle of economic and fiscal coordination. This actually includes annual country reports for all member states, each highlighting progress and challenges in implementing SDG-related policies. Externally, building on the European Consensus on Development, all EU institutions and member states are committed to supporting partner countries in implementing the SDGs. The Global Gateway strategy takes this further, together with the pursuit of EU priorities, such as support for a sustainable recovery, aligned with the SDGs. The SDGs remain an integral part of President von der Leyen's political guidelines for the new mandate and are embedded in all Commission proposals, policies, and strategies. While maintaining and reinforcing Europe's competitiveness is the defining element of the new priorities, sustainability in its various dimensions, social, economic, and environmental, is an inherent part of the agenda. Therefore, the guidelines put emphasis on sustainable competitiveness, which was at the core of milestones such as the Competitiveness Compass and the Clean Industrial Deal. As pointed out in Commissioner Dombrovskis's foreword to the report discussed today, the implementation of the 2030 Agenda is key to strengthening the EU's resilience against current and future shocks. The Commission Competitiveness Compass will help secure sustainable growth and prosperity. The Clean Industrial Deal brings together climate action and competitiveness under one overarching growth strategy. It is a commitment to accelerate decarbonization, reindustrialization, and innovation, all at the same time and across the entire continent, also reinforcing Europe's resilience. Other initiatives will continue to further the implementation of SDGs in each policy area, and many of these are outlined in the individual chapters of today's monitoring report. The implementation of SDGs is a matter for all. Engagement with stakeholders and practitioners will be a cornerstone of the Commission's approach towards successful implementation of EU rules. Regular implementation dialogues between commissioners and stakeholders will provide opportunities to assess progress, identify areas needing attention, and to gather feedback on what is working and what is not. We must overcome war, pandemics, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. As we continue to work and promote and defend the universality of human rights, we should continue fighting to eliminate hunger and eradicate poverty in all its forms, leaving no one behind. I encourage you to take the time to delve into this report, and I hope it will provide you with valuable insights and empower you to be a catalyst for positive change in our shared future. That's all from me. Thank you.
And with that, we wrap up our webinar on the latest edition of the SDGs Monitoring Report. Thank you to our speakers, to Friederike Oehler for providing us with an overview of the report on the EU's progress towards the SDGs, and to Lucian Parvelescu for explaining the role of the new European Commission priorities regarding the implementation of the SDGs in the EU. And many thanks to you, our viewers, for joining us. Remember that you can find more information on the SDGs section on the Eurostat website. You'll see the link for that at the end of this webinar. On that webpage, you can access the most recent information regarding the monitoring of the EU's progress towards the SDGs, and you can connect to the SDGs and Me tool to compare progress by country. And remember, if you have any further questions, you can contact our multilingual user support service. In the meantime, we wish you a great data-informed summer season, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Goodbye for now from Eurostat in Luxembourg.